welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm so pleased that Dina introduced us. We were having a random conversation, and I said, "Come on the podcast," and she said, "No, you need to talk to Alex."
Oh, that's
Um,
very nice.
I I really like to know about people's personal stories or their
Mhm.
journey that led them to get to where they are,
Mhm.
and for me, it's why charity is that something you've always done and why diversity matters.
Well, I've pretty much always done charities. Actually, when I went to university and wanted to, I studied politics at university and wanted actually to go into politics. So my
Hmm.
first job after university was as a sort of political advisor, researcher, and so I've done a little bit of that. But I guess things that happened to me, also being an LGBTQ plus person, kind of realizing that, you know that well for me that I wanted a career that in some way advocated for rights of minoritized people, all minoritized people, but also specifically LGBTQ people.
Mm.
So one of my reasons for wanting to go into politics was to do that. But I sort of realized that being outside of politics, but doing, working in the third sector might be kind of a better route to doing that. And that was kind of my experience in politics, some significant things that happened to me, which I can talk more about. And yeah, so I've spent kind of maybe about 12 years working in the charity sector and the rest of my adult life working in politics.
Mm.
Um, because I think when you're working for a charity, obviously you want to sort of make the world a better place for the people that you support or the work you do. But also one route to making the world a better place is by kind of changing policy, changing law, and so on. So it is
Yeah.
helpful to have that kind of understanding of how decision making works.
Mm.
And also you get contacts. So, sometimes I meet MPs to talk about the work of diversity role models and so on. So yeah. Um, um, Connection with the organization. So my first job as a charity CEO was I kind of set up an organization that supports sex workers when they're victims of crime.
Oh, lovely.
So it was yeah, an area that I got into kind of, I don't know, by chance more than anything, but I just really believed in the cause.
Mm.
And that was a charity which when I came to the position, it was a project that the government had actually funded to set up, and I was appointed to set up the project from kind of a concept. So it wasn't my idea, but I set up the
Okay.
organization with one other person, and there were just two of us. And then after about I think it was the second year the organization as it had existed, we won this kind of award that helped catapult us into being a really well respected organization. And that award was the Third Sector Award for Small Charity, Big Impact.
Mm.
And when we won that award, I was then asked to be as an expert judge at those same awards the following year. And when I
Hmm.
was judging that category that I'd won the previous year, diversity role models were one of the shortlisted charities. So
Right.
at that point, it was the first time I'd heard of diversity role models. But I thought when I was kind of reading the submission and judging that, I was
Mm.
thinking, if only an organization like that had existed when I went to school and had come into my school, my whole life could have been different. My kind
Yeah.
of, how quickly I came to terms with myself and who I was would have been different and so on.
Mm.
And that, so I was one of the judges that helped Diversity Role Models win that award, and Diversity Role Models won that award, which I think was one of the first big awards that Diversity Role Models won. And then that was, I think, 2014.
Mm.
So like 10 years later, I became CEO. So yeah, so that's kind of what brought me to Diversity Role Models. But obviously that knowledge for me, I went to school when Section 28 was still in force. And I remember when I was about 12 years old, going to a teacher after a sort of sex education lesson privately and saying, right, okay, you've talked to us about what happens when it's a man and a woman. How about when it's two guys or two girls? And the teacher and that was my way of slowly coming out to that teacher.
Yeah.
But she was a teacher that I felt I could trust. She was kind of younger, and I just assumed that she was a teacher who was more likely to be supportive. But
Yeah.
she said, "I really want to talk to you about this, but I'm really not allowed. I'll get in trouble."
Yeah.
And I was like, that. that was quite a bad experience because,
Mm,
you know, I was my way of reaching out to a teacher and feeling kind of lonely and not knowing who to talk to about this thing that I was experiencing
mm,
as a young gay guy. And being kind of shut down in that way. And I don't blame
mm.
her individually, but obviously the law
No.
section 28 meant that teachers were scared to talk about that and offer support.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow. I I wouldn't blame her. Um, I was born after, not long after, and it just, I wouldn't even say it was taboo when I was growing up in
Okay.
the early 90s, if I'm honest, Alex. It was, it was, in some ways, I think if it had been taboo, at least it would have been at the forefront. Like the controversy generates debates,
Mhm.
but it wasn't even talked about. It was
Yeah.
just not brought up. It wasn't a thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Only in jest. And so I don't really blame the older generation or that kind of generation and the way things were at the time. And I know that a lot of people have really good intentions, as you say, it's the fear and you don't know how to tackle it.
Yeah.
But I think the other point that you made, which is really important, where diversity role models, I think, is really sort of, it's got that differentiation, is you're tackling the issue at grassroots level.
Totally.
And what you just said now, I really identify with, where it took you quite a long time to come to know who Alex is, and come to your own and get comfortable with who you are later on in life. And even now, for me, as a woman of color at 45, I'd say it's only in the last 5 years that it's not that I'm not comfortable. I'm very proud of my background, but it's just kind of owning it. And it, do you know what it is? There's a really there's a difference, and I don't know if you've experienced this, between feeling proud of who you are versus getting comfortable with that and navigating your way around it and overcoming the years of feeling like an imposter in the workplace.
Yeah. Oh,
And I
totally. Yeah.
think they're so different.
Yeah.
Um, and when I have been in boardrooms with people I've worked with, and they've wanted to talk about diversity, and they don't come from a diverse background necessarily, you could see that they have really good intentions, but at least they've experienced that kind of trauma. I
Yeah.
think it's very difficult for them to understand where to go with it. And a lot of the time, they have their childhood experiences and then they're getting on with work and life. And there isn't that transition into how to tackle it as an adult. So this is where I feel like is a differentiator. And I want you to talk to me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I think your point about you know, even well-intentioned people who haven't experienced any kind of difference, if they're perceived differently or being kind of a minority or anything, I think sometimes well-intentioned people can still feel quite awkward.
Mm,
You know, and sometimes and like they and I if me just being who I am makes other people feel awkward, it's not really their fault, but it's all it also makes me feel awkward.
yeah.
So yeah, and it's I think for allies, whether it's you know on any issue, so whether it's sexual orientation, gender identity, race, etc. I think for allies just to be kind of open and curious and kind.
Mm,
And then for people like LGBTQ people to kind of I've got this phrase that I always use, don't sometimes you need to call people out, but sometimes it's easier just to call people in. So like if people who I know who are well intentioned, their language might not be perfect because they're just learning, I try and be kind and I try and help educate them rather than, you know, say, oh, that I'm offended because you used a certain word or whatever. You know, if it's well intentioned um and there's no kind of malice intended, then I think let's kind of help allies to be better allies rather than kind of pushing them away. I think it's bringing people together rather than creating barriers between people. And I think that's really important in the workplace for sure.
yeah. And it's really interesting that you've said that, because in some ways you're saying there's a little bit of work that we need to do ourselves so that we are not always on the defensive or
Yeah.
assuming that bad intention or malice. And it's almost like you need to, actually become aware of your own feelings and how certain things that might be said to you can impact you in the moment, but actually take a step back and assess what you've just heard and think of ways of talking to that person
Yeah.
and sort of saying, pulling to one side and just say, oh, you know what, actually, you just asked me this, and actually, I'd like to tell you a little bit more. And maybe if you think about saying it in this way, it might feel more inclusive for people on the receiving end.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. Because I think no one wants to be made to feel stupid or kind of old-fashioned or, and I think about that when I sort of have conversations with my parents because, my parents are from like a working class town in the northwest of England. Um, and they haven't lived in big cities. They haven't really experienced the kind of diversity that I experience every day living in London.
Mm,
And yeah, and I don't want to make, my mum's been a really positive influence on my life. I don't want to make her feel stupid because she might not have the words to,
yeah.
um, yeah. So that's kind of always my person that I think of when I'm thinking about how to kind of bring people on board with diversity and inclusion rather than pushing them away.
Yeah, absolutely. And also being able to identify a little bit of banter and have a laugh with people
Totally.
versus when it needs to become a serious conversation. And I know that storytelling is a big part of diversity role models and the work that you do. Um, Tell me about how you feel that that's been really effective, and where you've seen it really working both at organizational level and education level, secondary education level as well.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. Storytelling, what we do is all about storytelling. And there's a
Okay.
stat I think I sometimes remember it slightly wrong, but I think it's people are 27 times more likely to remember a human story than a plain fact. And that's one of the things we say at Diversity Role Models. So what we do, we go into schools of all ages. And we have a facilitator who is usually a member of staff, but we have some facilitators who are volunteers who runs a workshop. But part of that workshop is, and this is why we're called diversity role models, is we have a volunteer who is the role model who
Mm,
goes into school, and part of that is they tell their story. And that could be a story about, experiencing bullying for being different. It could be a story about coming to terms with themselves, whether they're, a trans person of color or a gay woman or all kinds of whatever their lived experience is, sharing a part of their story to help build connection with the young people in the classroom. And I feel like I try and go into the classroom and do that myself as well, even though I'm obviously the CEO. And when I first did it, I was talking about my experience this was at a high school level, and I was so scared that people kind of would realize that I was gay as a 10, 11, 12 year old, that I tried to create a version of myself that was like so straight. So I became really kind of obsessed with being good at football.
mhm.
And in the end, I still play football now, so it's become an important part of my
Amazing.
identity.
You gained
Um,
something there.
yeah, exactly. And
Skills.
I
Yes.
actually love football now, but for me, kind of throwing myself into football and being good at football was a way of like making myself immune to being seen as gay.
Mm,
And it kind of worked to some extent, although I did experience some bullying, from actually football teammates and so on.
yeah.
But now I still play football, and that when I tell that story in schools, I think that builds a connection with certain groups, particularly of boys,
Mm,
who might be, and this is kind of I'm stereotyping here now, but might be the types of boys that might bully
mm,
other boys for not being seen as masculine or whatever. So I think me going there saying, look, I'm gay, but I also play football and I've
mm.
got loads of awards playing
And
football.
I'm damn good
It
at it.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it builds that connection, I think, and kind of breaks down those stereotypes about what masculinity is, what being a boy is, what playing football is. And also for, even for girls who play football
Yeah.
as well, because lots of the girls put their hands up as well and they say, so obviously football isn't just for boys. There's lots of girls who play football, lots of women who
Yeah.
play football. So it just kind of things like that. And it shows just how pervasive those stereotypes are. And sometimes you know, in themselves, they're not kind of malicious stereotypes that
No.
but it does kind of limit what people believe they can be and who they and it can create shame if you're a bit different to those stereotypes and so on. So that's kind of our work. The storytelling element of our work, I think, is really important.
But it's interesting. I think I don't think stereotypes are necessarily bad, but I do agree with you that it does limit what you're able to do. And what you said, I really again identified with it, where you said you went in to do football just to try and break who you really were, but
Yeah.
you've ended up enjoying it, loving it, winning lots of awards and being really good at it. And it reminded me of when I was in the creative industry, which I won't go into detail, but I I I sort of got back into it in my late 20s, early 30s. And looking back, I did really well. And I know I should be proud of myself. But if I was to do it all again now, it would come from a place of love.
Mhm.
And that's the main difference. And these are the types of, these are the, I don't want necessarily to break the stereotypes, but what I want people to feel, or young people especially, is that if you want to do it because you love it, and it's not typically something that is that a lot of boys like to do, or the majority of girls like to do, please do it, but not because you're trying to change
Yeah.
anything, but because you really want to. And it makes such a difference because you're actually being compassionate towards yourself. And that work starts at home. You
Yeah,
have to have that
totally.
self acceptance and that self love and approach with love before you can even have a hope in hell of being able to convince other people to see that. And, and your self belief and your energies is going to be obvious.
Yeah,
Um,
totally. Yeah. And that resonates with me because actually looking back, I don't think I enjoyed playing football that much at school because I was doing it to try and prove something to
yeah.
myself and to other people. Whereas now I really enjoy playing football. And, since I left school, I've enjoyed football more than I did when I was at school, even though it was, a huge part of my life.
Mm. And it's almost like you go through these life cycles of realization, and each one kind of gives you a building block for
Yeah.
the next cycle and the next challenge. And so although I think obviously the work at schools is so fundamental and it's the core of what you do, and it's helping shift that mindset of the younger generation towards self-belief and compassion
Yeah.
and approaching things from a place of love. There is the lost generations that you go in and talk to at the
Yeah.
workplace. And I often wonder, if I had been more aware of these things, and if the things that you guys do were available to me at a younger age, how would I have how would I have approached my career? How would I have approached my growth journey? And so it's great that you're tackling that head on. And I think through storytelling, because empathy is the most powerful thing that we
Absolutely.
can share as human beings. We don't need to we don't need to celebrate or understand. If we can just start with empathy,
Yeah.
it's good.
Yeah,
Because I think
absolutely.
that's
Yeah.
what you have to. So what I would find really interesting is kind of understanding, how does the work that you do at the board level and within organizations with adults, grown adults, how does that differ, and where do you see change being made?
Yeah. So obviously we do tailor the work we do slightly differently in workplaces. And we work with a variety of workplaces. So some workplaces, it's kind of like the LGBT staff network or something like that have asked us to do a session for like all their staff networks together.
Mm,
And that's really important because that's kind of building empathy. So it's kind of like, oh, if I'm a disabled person and I have these issues in the way people treat me differently in a workplace, then maybe I can connect my own experiences with someone who has a different identity that might affect the way other people treat them. So that's kind of building empathy across different protected characteristics or different, identities, kind of the intersectional thing, which is really important.
yeah.
But also we get sometimes like there's one massive company, for example, that is an Indian company who asked us to do some work with their staff, and they said in advance that you know that a lot of the people who work there are quite culturally conservative. And the person who actually arranged it is a straight ally, a male straight ally, who wanted us to come in and do this. But he said that initially some of the concepts might be quite surprising to some of the people there, but even just taking people into a place where they're kind of seeing difference, and they're like going back to the empathy, they're building empathy and so on, can make a huge difference. And those workshops were really, really well received. Um, yeah, so it's kind of from different companies, it's a completely different experience. And like one of our partners is Mildred's, the vegan restaurant in London. I think there's about five of them, and
Yes,
we're going to be
I
doing
love
them.
Mildred.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in Pride Month, they do quite a lot of stuff for us. So yeah, make sure you go to one of
I
the
will,
ones in
yes.
Pride Month. But we're also going to be doing stuff for their leadership team and their staff and so on. And I suspect they're because of, I mean, again, I'm stereotyping, but because they're a London-based vegan restaurant, I suspect their staff are pretty switched on to diversity and inclusion, but maybe not. So that might be a bit more, things like unconscious bias might be a bit more relevant there, where people might think that or might, in general be kind of liberal and have experience of mixing with lots of people from different backgrounds and with different identities. It might be that there are things they're not aware of that they do. And I think, yeah, the storytelling element of that is really important as well. And often when we do workplace delivery as well, we call it workshops, we bring in volunteers as well who might have a different experience. And it might be that we bring in someone who has intersectional experiences. So they might be disabled, person of color, and LGBTQ plus. So I guess showing that we all carry, I mean, most of my perceived differences aren't kind of that visible because I'm a white guy, but we all carry multiple layers of difference. And, many of us, even if we don't on the surface look like we have experienced oppression, we probably have, like, yeah, we've all been through. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a really funny cartoon. It's got um, someone someone who's fallen off a cliff. This is quite hard to explain visually, and there's a man leaning over the cliff, holding on to this person, and to try and kind of lift them up. And this person wants them to pull them up, but there's I think it's a snake in like a hole on the cliff that's kind of like about to bite the person's
Yeah.
arm. So it's kind of like I think I can't describe it very well, but broadly the illustration is trying to say you don't know what other people are experiencing.
Yes.
So like if you can't see that the snake is trying to grab this person's arm so they can't lift you up and so on. Yeah, so I think it's you may not know, but someone might have had a really bad day, so just be kind.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think what I love about the diversity role models of people going in and focusing on storytelling in the workplace is the it's not I don't think it's necessarily, and I've seen this and happen, and again, it's with all the best intentions in the world, it's not always the best idea, and it's not necessarily on the people from the diverse backgrounds in the workplace to sit down and talk about these
Yeah,
things.
yeah,
But you are there to do a job just like everybody else. You're not there to educate them. And I think taking that pressure off and having someone like you with your shared experiences coming in and making people aware of what it feels like to say, not say, do not do. I'll give you a really quick example. When I was a trainee, there was myself and one other girl uh, from an ethnic group.
yeah,
They were all really, really lovely. But I remember one time, one of the other girls said to me, "Oh, you and what's her name? You guys can hang out and share a room and do your thing because you're both." And she stopped. And I said, "Both what?" You know? And honestly, I wasn't upset with her. But again, I think it would have been so awkward for me personally to turn around. And also people say, oh, you're making a big deal about it. You know, it's that kind of, again, unintended gaslighting culture.
Yeah, totally.
You
Yeah.
know all about it. So for me, I always think of that as an example. It was not anything major, but it kind of still gives you that weird, sick feeling inside, like, oh, here we go again, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah,
And I think somebody going in, somebody like her, she's a really lovely girl. If she had just heard from someone else coming in and having a chat once or twice a year, it's not a big ask
yeah,
to say, and it should be mandatory because you have to work with us, so you have to sit down and listen to our stories vicariously through someone else because they are relevant, because you are talking to us and you're not aware of certain things that you're
yeah.
saying, and it's such a tiny change. And if someone had just said or something similar along those lines, hopefully the penny drops.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about in the workplace, I feel like not really a duty, but I feel like I want to help my peers, you know, understand me and so on. But equally, I don't want to have to do all the work for someone else to be a kind of a respectful colleague and so on. So that's why I guess bringing people in from outside to do that work and having mandatory training and making it really explicit, in policies and all that stuff is really important because it can be. I remember in the wake of the George Floyd murder,
Mm,
the organization that I was CEO of at the time, we had, I don't know, probably a third of our staff were people of color.
mm,
And that had, and it was a bigger, much bigger organization than diversity role models. And I know that had a massive impact on those people in the staff team in particular, and also people we were supporting because we were supporting men and boys who'd experienced sexual violence. So a lot of our clients were people of color and so on. So that had this like massive, massive impact. But I was really conscious as CEO that I didn't want the people in the organization who were people of color to kind of take all the responsibility to help the white people and the people with white privilege in the organization to kind of have that understanding and growth and all that. So we tried to work, hard to develop a kind of training programs and so on, and about kind of cultural humility and things like that, so that it wasn't the onus and the responsibility wasn't completely on the people of color in the organization, because that would just become exhausting.
mm.
Yeah.
How do you tackle someone turning around and saying, well, that's all well and good, but at the end of the day, you know, how far you get in life and what you end up doing in life and where you go in life should be based on merit. What would be your answer to that? I know
Well,
what I would
it's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question because it's kind of like the equality of opportunity versus kind of equality of like outcomes and so on. And I mean, I would say yes, I totally agree, but it's in the society that we live in with so many structural inequalities, that isn't what's happening, so and not only that people based on their experiences, if you just look at kind of workplace stats on certain professions, what proportion of people come from wealthy backgrounds and come from private schools and men and are white men and all those things, then it's obvious that meritocracy doesn't exist because of all the structural inequalities that exist. So I'd say that, but I'd also say there are other things than if you think having a boardroom of all white men um, based on their perceived merits because they've got the best education or whatever is a good way to run a company. I would say it absolutely isn't, because you need a diversity of thought. And true innovation comes from having a diversity of thought and people from different backgrounds as well. So I would say that meritocracy doesn't exist when you've got so many structural inequalities anyway. So you need to level the playing field.
Mm,
Um, but secondly, I would say um, what does merit mean? What does kind of ability mean? And I think I'd much rather, I mean, if I think back of all the people I've worked with, um, the most kind of wonderful and amazing and brilliant people who've challenged me the most are not white men, let's say.
mm,
Like they're not they're they're people from different backgrounds bringing different perspectives that challenge my own perspective. So I think that's also really important as well.
And so we hopefully are going to see the next generation of scientists and vets and sports people and whatever it is that they want to do, and the barrier is not a psychological one that's been based on self-limiting beliefs because of those stereotypes and the things that and the imposter syndrome that we develop. And this is what I love about the work that you do. um Call to action for organizations. What practical steps can schools, businesses, and policymakers take to support your mission of fostering empathy and understanding around differences, other than opening their doors to you to let you in?
Yeah.
And yeah, and I
That, I
want
mean,
to,
that would be the first one.
yeah.
Yeah, let us in, speak to us. But there are, there are other organizations as well. But it does make a huge difference. And I think also, be mindful that people have things about themselves that they might not be open about. So it's, if I think for a company or a school or whatever, just to assume that what you see with someone, how they look, is their whole identity, is wrong. And so I think be explicit about, be explicit that you're supportive of people, whatever their identity, make that really explicit, and, set up groups for LGBTQ people, for people of color, for carers, parents, mothers, make it so that your workplace has people with lived experience that can kind of get together, share their lived experience with each other. And also, if it's in the case of a company, they can take that to the management and leadership so that, people are treated well in companies. I mean, there's no, those kind of networks are really important so that
Mm,
people in leadership positions can actually learn how they can be better and how they can change policies for whether it's maternity and paternity or people with disabilities. I mean, every day that I go into a company, I learn something new about, like only recently I was meeting with people from a neurodiversity network in a
mm,
company, a big company. Um, and I, myself, I'm neurotypical. I've got friends who are neurodiverse, but just in speaking to this group of 5 or 6 neurodiverse people, I learned a lot about neurodiversity and how things in the workplace that wouldn't have even occurred to me can have a limiting impact on
mm,
people who are neurodiverse. So I think you only really learn about how to create an inclusive space by listening to people. And if those people in your organization, whatever their identity, feel that they need to hide part of themselves, then that's never going to be kind of cascaded up the leadership that their needs. So I think
mm.
that's really important.
It's Pride Month coming up,
Yes.
a few days away. um Tell me what it means for you.
It's really interesting because, I mean, for purely for a diversity role models perspective, it's a really important month for us because we do lots of fundraising and so on. So it's a busy month, but a month that I also enjoy. On a personal level, um, this Pride Month, I think, is a particularly important one because I think it's a really difficult time for LGBTQ people right now. Like the even on a personal level, I've experienced more homophobia in the last year than I had years and years before. So I think there's kind of a move kind of away from LGBT rights and so on. And so I think this Pride is going to be even more political than it has been for years. And there's a cliche, pride is a protest, but also a celebration. Well, I think at the moment we can celebrate our solidarity as a community and our kind of resilience, but I
Yeah.
also think there needs to be an element of protest, and we need to sort of say to politicians, you need to do more for us. Things aren't good. Yeah, so I think it's a really important time for Pride.
Alex, why, and please be really candid, I think I might know the answer, but why are you experiencing more of that? And I think the mainstream media, by the way, has a massive role to play. And I really want to talk really openly about the role of mainstream media and what I've seen and what it's kind of propagated. It's almost like I feel like a lot of the way that the stories are told, the information being fed, is purposely designed to rile people up and tap into the homophobes and So
Yeah.
why do you think that is?
So I do think the mainstream media definitely has a role to play. Like obviously, like there's been a lot of focus on trans people in particular, and kind of a
Mm,
fear mongering, which trans people are such a small proportion of the population, and there's like a fear mongering which kind of mirrors the 1980s, the conversations about gay people, gay men in particular, about people not being safe in certain spaces with trans people and so on. And
mm,
although transphobia is definitely on the rise, but that does embolden people who just don't like people who are different. And I think people who may have views that are, homophobic or transphobic now feel that this is kind of more okay to have these
yeah,
views. So I think that's definitely something that's been happening. And I also do think the obviously the rise of kind of the far right in the UK. I think in general, um, people are kind of a bit frustrated with the economy. People are frustrated with, um, well, the fact that prices are going up and incomes aren't going up and
yeah,
all those things, energy prices are going up. And I think sometimes people kind of lash out at the other, and the
yeah,
other can be migrants, it can be asylum seekers, it can be women, it can be trans people, it can be gay people, and so on. So I do think there's kind of a almost like a perfect storm of media kind of othering people and creating kind of fear about LGBTQ plus people, but also I think people genuinely and rightfully are frustrated with their lives, and I think sometimes that can lead to people kind of blaming others. So the whole like idea that DEI is now diversity, equity, and inclusion is causing people to get promoted who wouldn't otherwise be promoted and all
mm,
this. I mean, it's not really true, but I can see why if you're a white 60-year-old man who, was made redundant and struggling to make ends meet, you might think that, oh, without really understanding what it is, you might think that diversity, equity, inclusion is meaning that women are getting promoted above him or migrants are getting or gay people or whatever. And
yeah,
then I think that leads people to lash out. So I think there's just this kind of horrible climate. And also, I don't think are the two main political parties now, I think are too worried about trying to please the Daily Mail.
mm,
And they're worried about that proportion of the electorate more than other proportions of the electorate. Like I was listening to a podcast this morning, um, and there's this kind of real focus on young white men,
mm,
um, because there's this idea that online kind of misogyny and things like that are taking young white men into a place that we don't want them to go, which is obviously we don't want young white men to be like that. But equally, how about young women, for example? And actually, if you look at the polls, young women are at the moment, I think the most popular political party amongst young women is the Green Party, because the Green Party are more liberal and more focused on climate change and environment and
yeah,
so on. But you don't see the two main parties trying to appeal to that demographic by, if anything, they're moving away from that demographic. So I just think it's really interesting times politically, um, for LGBTQ plus people, but also anyone who, experiences any kind of oppression. So women, um, people of color, etc. Yeah,
yeah. Agreed. And I do agree with you that bigotry becomes more prevalent of any type when people are struggling with life.
yeah,
And it's this classic divide and conquer strategy.
totally.
Thank you for being so honest and candid and sharing that. I think it's so important that we start to recognize that more and again do the work. Every time you're feeling annoyed at something not going right, is it really the gay person or the migrant that's taken your
Yeah,
job? I don't
exactly.
think so, mate. You know?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Uh, Tell me if you're allowed to about some of the organizations that you've worked with and how the process works in terms of the you go in, you do the work, you are paid, you receive that funding, and how then that channels back into diversity role models and allows you um to be able to source the best people and the best ways to work on your education program.
Yeah, so we've worked with a lot of big companies. Like one of our partners is, as I said, Mildred's. Disney has been one of our partners for quite a
Hmm.
while. And Disney, so sometimes with Mildred's, they do lots of fundraising during Pride Month. Disney have been kind of, we've had a really good partnership with their sort of LGBT staff network, their Pride network, for a long time. So they do fundraising for us, but sometimes we'll also do session, workshops for their staff as well. Um, uh, or other companies like Deutsche Bank. So we've worked with lots of banks.
I think that workplaces, adults, we need to take responsibility for how we educate and inform the next generation. We need to remove the roadblocks, we need to remove the limits, and whatever your personal beliefs are, believe those, but be a kind person.
Yeah.
And that's the main message. And I really wish you all the best with Pride this month. I know it will be a difficult time because of everything that's happened, but I think I agree with you. I think it needs to actually be about activism, and the main thing for me is education is the strongest tool
Totally.
that we can possibly have. And I'm so grateful that you've shared this with me, Alex.
No worries. Thank you for inviting me. I've had
Thank
a really good
you.
chat.
It's been a
Really
pleasure.
enjoyed it.